Welcome back to the Palm Court Podcast. Mike Palmer, joined as always by Megan Citron and Grant Balfour. How are you folks today?
Yes.
Good and hot. Madrid is hot, and I hear Florida is hot. I'm happy to report that Brooklyn is also hot. It's June. We're recording this on Juneteenth. Happy Juneteenth, everyone. And we are delighted to be joined today by Dr. Eric Schickler, class of 87, who overlapped with all three of us temporally. We were all at New College in the late 80s together. Eric, welcome to the Palm Court Podcast.
Great to be here with you.
For folks who have been following podcast coverage that I've done about the New College hostile takeover, before there was a Palm Court podcast, my education podcast, Trending in Education, Trending in Ed, had covered this. And one of the early interviews that I did, we'll include a link to it in the show notes, was with Eric, because you've actually done research in political science that is very much germane, I like to say that word, to this conversation. As we just get started, though, Eric, can you catch folks up on who you are and how you connected to New College?
Sure. So I grew up in the Boston area. I always thought I'd go to a liberal arts college or wanted to go to a liberal arts college, but my mindset was very much Northeastern liberal arts colleges there. I'd gotten a little pamphlet from New College that I remember thinking, wow, that sounds really interesting and cool, and addressed some of my own ambivalences about why exactly am I going to college? And I remember it just kind of resonated, but I put it aside and kind of, because it just seemed so inconceivable. I'd never actually been to Florida in my life. But I applied early decision, I guess, to Swarthmore and got in. And initially they offered a tiny bit of money, but then you had to send in more financial aid. And they basically they reduced that even further to an even tinier amount. Just remember being like, this is just crazy. The only reason we don't qualify for so much is because my parents are working class, never spent a penny, and so we're spending and saving. So I was going to go through all their savings, and I wasn't even sure that was what I wanted to do. So I withdrew. I don't remember exactly when, February, March, something like that.
Late.
Late, and New College had the rolling admissions, and I was like, I remember, hey, there was that weird college in Florida that looked kind of cool. And so I applied at the last minute without visiting or anything. And oh man. And after my arrival in August, that first day of orientation was my first time on my own, my first time stepping foot in the state of Florida.
That's a lot.
I would like that as well. And I think there's a lot of people who came through the rolling admission policy.
Yeah. And then this was 87. And, a topic we'll get into in a bit is your take on the Lorax Rebellion, where it sounds like you were an eyeball witness in our Rashomon-like retelling of what happened in that fateful spring day of 1988. We'll get into that. It's a little foreshadowing, a little tease for folks a little bit later. But in terms of your actual experience at New College, I imagine,
Marty, being
able to finance your college or, not go into debt, not go into your parents' savings was part of what drew you there, in addition to the academic philosophy. But, you were noteworthy by the time I got there a year after you. And then you stayed pretty involved in both the basketball side of things, which was a place where I got to know you probably best, but then also in student government and a lot of other aspects of campus life. Can you talk us through a little bit what your academic and social experience was like at New College?
Sure. I would say when I first got there day one, I was a little bit like, wow, this is kind of crazy. It is so hot. I got a sunburn walking to the bank. My roommate, who was turned out to be a great guy, but was wearing a leather jacket in the 90+ degree heat.
Yeah.
It seemed kind of crazy. But either day one or day two, started building a great group of friends, a bunch of whom I'm still friends with today: Robin Kirkpatrick, Gwen Davies, Marty Kelly. Formed a very early kind of clump of people that then expanded out the whole, Josh Benjamin a little bit after that now. And so developed a really great set of friends, and we kind of went through this journey together. It's such a transformational place, growing up in the Boston area. just very kind of reserved, a little uptight. And New College is not like that. And so
Yeah.
develop a different kind of approach to things. And so that was something that was, of great value to me. And so I initially felt, really connected socially there early on. My classes, first semester took a class from Gene Lewis, Intro to American Politics. Gene was clearly a complicated personality. There are people who loved him, people who didn't like him as much. For me, it was just a great teacher and mentor, and did it though in a way that was just in your face,
Yeah.
question all your assumptions, not accept any BS, challenge you. I still remember early in the semester, he's teaching about the welfare state in the US, right? And he gets in our faces and he's like, so Morning Bob, who was the
I love Morning Bob.
in our class that day, he happened to be outside, like doing landscaping or something.
Yeah.
And so
Smiling. He was probably smiling.
smiling and ready to say morning to you. Yeah. And Gene points at Morning Bob and he says, why should Morning Bob's tax dollars go so you, a bunch of middle-class kids, in many cases, should get a free education? Why should he have to do that, right? You guys are a bunch of welfare babies.
Huh.
Like a simple reading of that could be like, oh, he's telling us that shouldn't be the policy, right? Why should it be? That's not at all what he's doing. What he was trying to do is teach us all to understand we're all beneficiaries of a state government that provides services, one of which is outstanding education. But we need to be mindful we're benefiting every bit as much somebody taking from the government benefiting as the caricature. This is in the Reagan era where the welfare queen going on. And he's saying, no, we're all welfare recipients. We're all getting benefits. We need to, and then that gives us a responsibility to use them. You take this benefit from the state of Florida and do good things, right? Learn and then do things with our degrees. That's the kind of approach he took. It's not something like, years later, as a teacher myself,
Right.
I could never imagine myself getting in my students' faces and saying something like that.
And just to maybe fast forward into that too, like you've been a professor for many years in political science. Can you catch folks up on that and fast forward like into who you are today?
Sure. Yes. I've been teaching at Berkeley, UC Berkeley in political science since roughly 1997. So yeah, long time teacher, love teaching. The inspiration to go into teaching definitely came from New College and Gene and other outstanding teachers I had. I never anticipated teaching at a big public, big university. My image from New College was I want to go teach because I want to teach seminars just like that.
Right.
And, that's for the most part not what I do, but
That's the part that is striking to me too, just like how rare that is, that kind of seminar experience as an undergrad, certainly in the US, but just really kind of anywhere to the best of my knowledge. And the fact, to your point, that this was like a public university in Florida back in the day, it does make you appreciate how fortunate we were to kind of get that experience when we did.
Sure. Yeah. Now the small classes, the fact that the faculty were around so much, tutorials, studies. I mean, we really did have an opportunity to learn to write, to think. You couldn't sit there in most classes, you had to show up ready.
Yeah.
If you were not ready, you would get called out. It would be a problem.
Right. And it was more like face, really, right? It was more like shame rather than your grade. It was like there were expectations,
It was a social shaming.
Yeah, your friends as much as anybody else, your fellow students.
Yeah.
That just, you teach it at classes now, you don't have that same, you just don't have that same.
Yeah.
Our grad students, I would say, our PhD students in a seminar, they are hoping half of them have done the reading, basically.
Right. I still remember my dad, my dad was, he was a professor and a doctorate and all that. And like when he was there, part of what he loved, because we did the visit together, was he's like, it's like a grad school, and that's where, you're an example as well of, the long history of academics and scholars who have had really kind of a jump off point. In some ways, you get ahead a little bit by being exposed to that at New College. And then if you decide it is the right path for you, it can really kind of set you on a trajectory. And then your research has also kind of circled back into New College and what's going on in higher education in America today. Can you touch on that?
Sure. So about a year and a half ago, was it that long? No, actually a little less than a year ago. It feels longer, given what's happened since. So I published a book on the development of a kind of new form of nationalized polarization in the U.S. It's called Partisan Nation, co-authored with Partisan here at Berkeley. And the basic idea in the book is that while the U.S. has been polarized in the past, parties polarized, hating each other quite a bit, within the context of a much more decentralized political system where state parties were really different from national parties. Interest groups were much more kind of localized, and the press was much more fragmented. And what that meant is that even if the national parties were really opposed to each other, there was a lot more diversity at the state level, a lot more opportunities for cross-cutting coalitions and so on to happen. And what's developed over the last 40 or 50 years is a situation where the states have really nationalized. Everything's nationalized. It's a combination of nationalization and polarization, we argue in the book, has created these really bad dynamics for American politics. Our political institutions were not designed for two national parties fighting it out across all levels of government in this kind of parallel way, no holds barred way. So one of our emphases in the book is on how this changes checks and balances, so that throughout American history, there have been presidents who tried to step beyond their legitimate power. But what's been striking is in the past, even some important members of the president's own party would tend to fight back against that, up for their institution's power, right? What we see happening over the last 30 years is as the members of Congress have all become part of these nationalized party teams and most afraid of losing a primary vote, saying where their national party goes against them.
Right.
That's created a dynamic where they're just going to side with the president no matter what of their party. So we talk in the book about how that's been especially dangerous on the Republican side, which is the more nationalized party, has this very strong right-wing press infrastructure that just penalizes, and social media infrastructure that penalizes any disloyalty, both with a primary challenge and potential violence threats in some cases. And, we worried when we talk about Trump's first term, it became clear that there was no action he could take that would lead a substantial number of Republicans to vote to impeach him and remove him from office, which just means if he then comes back into office, what we're seeing now is kind of what one would expect from now. And so the book is basically about that kind of global kind of danger to our political system. Stepping back, how does that relate to New College, you might ask?
Yeah, I think I might have asked that.
So you can really view what happened with DeSantis and the takeover in New College as a kind of microcosm of this broader story. So when we were all there in New College, one of the big support systems we had was there were Republican state legislators from Sarasota area. These were conservative individuals. They would not, if they showed up at a palm court party or even a law, they would not have been happy. Yet they supported funding the college. They supported keeping it independent. They did not see it as a potential vehicle in an ideological war.
Yeah.
And what that speaks to is how local representatives, for most of our history, looked at themselves as primarily thinking about what's good for our local area. And for those individuals, they thought, well, this school may not be my cup of tea in terms of everything that goes on, but it's good for Sarasota to have a high quality, well-respected liberal arts school, brings in arts, brings in thinkers, just gives it a kind of, a little bit more cachet that's just good for our community. And so if other Republicans were talking about cutting it, these Republicans would stand up for it.
Yeah.
Right? Now, what happens under DeSantis, though, is he sees this small school as a chance to help elevate his run for president, the culture warrior. I'm a culture warrior who gets stuff done.
Yep.
And he's thinking about New College, not in relation to Florida, but in relation to Fox News,
Hmm.
national influencers, right? And so when he takes action against New College, he himself is a product of or exemplar of this nationalization. And he's not thinking what's best for Florida's education system, right? You can certainly read what he did to UF and other schools in that.
Right.
He's thinking about what's going to help me win national office. And then crucially, the local Republican office holders in the state are not going to try to stand in his way because
Right.
they see themselves as part of this same kind of team where the main goal is fight the Democrats, fight the liberals,
Mm.
not, look after your community, the local community's distinctive interests, which aren't always going to be the same as the party.
Yeah.
Thank you for putting that out there. It's good to spell it out because it's also we're swimming in this stuff, but we don't always, take a moment to kind of like put it into a context. And then we'll include links to Eric's book in the show notes. And I know that, polarization within higher education is something we talked about as well when you were on Trending and Ed with me. You're in California, which is a very different public education system than what folks in Florida are experiencing. We'll get into more New College related stuff and, we definitely need to talk Lorax, but maybe one more beat on, the current state of higher ed, your reflections on that, based on your research and your experience.
Sure. Yeah. It's kind of funny. Nick Tampio, another alum, academic, great guy, great scholar, reached out to me 2 or 3 months ago because he's editing a special issue on higher ed and political science for a journal in poli-sci. And he's like, hey, would you want to write something about New College for this? And I thought about it. And my initial reaction, which I relayed to him, is I think I have a good op-ed to write about New College. I think that, it's not something I studied. I can't, that's not my comparative.
Yeah. You could speak ex cathedra about it.
But then I had a conversation with him and I talked to him a little bit more about the book. And I started to think about it more. By the end of the conversation, I was like, okay, I'm not going to write a paper. I can't write a scholarly paper on New College. But I can write one maybe where it becomes a kind of entry point or anecdote or starting point.
Mm-hmm.
Analysis is what I'm working on this summer with a grad student, Alina Rodriguez, is trying to understand how did higher ed become so polarized over the past 45 years?
Mm.
We've been coding national party platforms. We've been coding state party platforms. With looking at legislation. And one of the things you see, first of all, it's just striking. If you read a lot of Republican platforms in the 1980s and into the 1990s, and this is the Reagan era, right? A party that's becoming really conservative on a lot of things. But when it came to higher ed, they were generally supportive. They saw it as good for their states. I'm reading these Indiana platforms today, actually, how valuable we need to keep Indiana kids staying in the state. And the way we do that is a high quality education system with high quality colleges and universities. They see it as fundamentally local and supporting their constituents, right? California Republicans lambasting Democrats for the lack of spending on University of California, which incidentally, I remember when I started at UC in 97, some of my older colleagues told me, we do better with a Republican governor than a Democratic governor. Because the Democrat wants to spend money on a whole bunch of things, including higher ed. But one of the few things the Republican governor wants to spend money on is higher ed. Her kids are going to UC and it's valuable for the state. Okay. What we've seen over the last 25 years is just a dramatic shift in the Republican Party away from that. It seems like the entry wedge is concerns about ideological bias, concerns about free speech zones and political correctness.
Yep.
And then it's kind of spreads out from there to just a more general diminishment of what higher ed contributes. And so often you see states that basically Republican increasingly either don't talk about higher ed at all when they talk about education, or when they do, it's quite, often very critical.
Right.
And, I think from higher ed as a kind of industry, I think we kind of ignored what was going on over this 25-year period, right? And maybe in a two-party, it should have been thought of as an emerging crisis for higher ed. Of the two parties in a two-party system, increasingly viewing us as an enemy, right? So basically, the article is going to kind of narrate or try to tease out how that happened. I think one thing that's interesting about higher ed in comparison to some of the other issues that I've studied and other scholars have studied is that in most cases, when the parties have realigned on issues, it's often bubbled up from below, right? If you think about the civil rights realignment, I argue in my racial realignment book, that starts at the local and state level, and national leaders are kind of the last to move. Other scholars have studied abortion and gay rights and immigration and found kind of broadly similar kind of patterns. I think higher ed's different. I think this is really a case where a national kind of elite movement of kind of intellectuals who really didn't like what was going on kind of started with their first successes at the national level with Republican Party platforms, and they kind of permeated down. That relates back in some ways to this nationalization argument that Paul and I developed, where it may be that that kind of national-led strategy to create a wedge issue wasn't as effective 40 or 50 years ago. State and local folks would stand up. Hey, we may not love Harvard, but we love University of Florida for what it does for our state, or we love University of Indiana for what it does to our state.
You mentioned specific year ranges, like 45 years and 25 years. Are there like benchmarks or specific milestones? Like what happened like 45 years ago instead of like 50 years ago?
Yeah.
And what happened like 25 years ago that you would say, okay, this is a turning point?
That's a great question. National ones, we went back to 68. And you see some criticisms of campus disturbances, but it doesn't sustain. It kind of goes away quickly and is not couched in a more general critique. It goes alongside a lot of other positive. And so that then led to a decision when it came to coding the state ones. How far back do we go down? And we're doing it, maybe we shouldn't be doing it this way, but we're doing it the old-fashioned labor intensive. We're reading these things, you know, and not ChatGPT.
It's very 2025 conservative of you.
But anyways, the thought of 1980 is this is the start of the Reagan era. And so we want to get a snapshot of where Republicans, as they are becoming a more conservative party, right? It's not clear, you know, in the 60s and 70s, you know, there's a really strong moderate faction in the Republican Party, even some liberal Republicans. And Reagan is kind of where that ends. You know, if we had infinite labor, we would go back earlier, but that seemed like a reasonable starting point. But these decisions about timing are always, you want to start well before the realignment starts, basically. So you have enough before. And so the fact that we see this continuity in the 80s and into the 90s, I think makes me think it's a reasonable decision.
The cost of education, I'm just having lived outside the US for 25 years, the cost of education made it a much more elite proposition. And then indebting people for, 20 to 30 or God only knows how long of their life, that happening in conjunction with the corporatization of education in the US, even on the public school level, has to have a huge factor for the kind of bubbling up from underneath, lack of support for higher education. Wouldn't you say that has something to do with it?
Yeah, I do think the cost thing, and I think we're still grappling with exactly what we're going to do with that, but it's definitely, we've been coding for that. You see it a lot. Interestingly, the national ones talk a lot about the cost and start doing that in the late 90s, I would say, and really worrying about it and the debt on the Republican side. Not seeing as much on the state side as I would have expected on that. I'm not 100% sure why, but I think we're still literally doing the coding. I guess I'd say I hope to have a better answer to your question in the future. One of the so Lima's been taking the lead on the Democratic ones. And so
you saved the juicy part for yourself. I appreciate that.
Well, I just started, you have to do both. And she's having a lot of fun actually coding the Democrat. And the two things, the two insights she's shared with me so far, still early stages, but two things that were striking were, one, while all this change is happening on the Republican side, not much changes on the Democratic side. You don't see a lot of response to what's going on, which is kind of puzzling in its own way that they're not thinking, oh, we need to think about how do we defend higher ed in this new environment.
Right.
Relating to Megan's point, the cost stuff, while they start worrying about indebtedness eventually, they don't really criticize universities for costs.
Right.
And Alina's still working, but that's what she's relayed by reading a whole bunch of stuff already. think that's also, I mean, if you think about a story of polarization, I think this is clearly one that's driven by Republicans, but I do think that there's an important story on the Democratic side in terms of whether there were things they could have done differently,
Yep.
position the sector in a much better place, or at least a somewhat better place than it is now.
Nice. So I think folks get a little bit of continuing education credits for the political science part of our conversation today. We may go back in, but we also do want to bring this back home to Palm Court, get a little titular here. Actually, it wasn't Palm Court, it was near Palm Court. We definitely want to hear your takes on the Lorax. This is becoming like a book, based on the conversations from different perspectives about that fateful day back in May of '88. Before we get there, though, is there anything else, like more just around experiences of New College? Anything you want our listeners to hear? Any, like, also, fireside chat? Do you want to inspire people, warm some cockles? Whatever you feel.
Or scare them,
Or scare people,
Yeah.
fire and brimstone, sinners in the hand of an angry God. Whatever you want to do.
I think it makes sense to go into Lorax just because that, for me, was a big part of shaping my New College experience, and so I think that makes sense. So my first term, really enjoyed New College a lot. Started to go to Walls and really enjoyed partying at Walls and stuff, but was not at all involved in like campus politics, even at the smallest amount. Probably went to the town meetings. Then I think it was in January of ISP was when, in '88, was when the campus dean, Barilski, made this agreement with the airport about the Grove moving the road, that they could build the road there rather than supporting the students who had worked out with an engineer this mild shift in the road that would have still accomplished their objectives as an airport while giving us, protecting that road as much as possible. And so that night when it first broke, Barilski came to the New College Student Alliance offices, and there was this overflow crowd of people asking him questions. And so I just sort of wandered by now, see what was going on and listened to him talk. And I remember him talking about how this is a good strategic deal for New College because it will secure the land to the north at Viking or something like that.
Like a general. Yeah.
Like a general. Yeah. Like thinking, I later realized he's like a Russian.
Like it was such a precious space too,
Yeah, exactly. It meant nothing to us. And so he just went on and was evading questions and not really, it was unimpressive, I would say. Various students were asking him great questions. And so like at some point, like I think probably near the end of that, like I asked a question, which I had not planned to do. And it was something along the lines of like, here these students have done all this work, all this diligence, engineers. Like, what kind of lesson are you sending to them about the political process by doing this, like undercutting all this work and just kind of selling them out without consulting? And I think he hemmed and hawed and didn't have much of an answer to it. Anyway, I left the meeting, and then after the meeting, I'm pretty sure it's Dave Dagan, who was New College president. Jonathan was vice president. Maybe Dave and Jonathan, because I knew Jonathan. I never met David. But
Jonathan White?
White.
Friend of the show. Yeah, it's just making sure.
And so either one or both of them sort of was like, hey, maybe you should run for Student Affairs Council. It's good to see you, we need first year reps. So I had not thought about doing. So I ran for SAC, somehow ended up being SAC chair while that was going on. I don't remember exactly how that happened. But I think some people would say probably David Dagan, who was like he was a brilliant political mind. There's more discussion in the whole story than he gets. It's self-imposed. He probably won't talk to anybody, but David probably like saw, I need an ally as SAC chair. This first year student who doesn't know much will probably. So anyway, so as SAC chair, and then as SAC chair, I got really involved in it. And a couple of things that I think stand out about what was going on.
So you were SAC chair when the Lorax thing happened?
When the Lorax thing.
Wow, good job by us.
The role, it's not necessarily that important what formal roles everybody had, but so that meant I was involved in had a pretty close eye on and was involved in a lot of the decision-making that spring, even though I hadn't been at all involved before that.
And this is your first year at New College.
Yeah, first year.
And you had engaged lawyers, right, at that time?
Yeah. And, you know, I think that's the piece that's like most impressive about what really, I mean, the people that for that stuff, David Dagan, Alan Hopper before him as president, Rob Westerfeld, who was the lobbyist, they were kind of the brain trust behind doing a lot of that. And, you know, they hired a lawyer, Judy Kavanaugh, who was like a serious, very serious environmental lawyer in the Sarasota area. Like, I've heard some people when they talk about the rebellion, they're like, oh, there was no chance this could have ever worked. You could have never succeeded. And it's like, actually, we had a like really excellent lawyer who had a reputation for winning all her cases, who thought we had a reasonable, like we had a good case. And so she took that on. She wouldn't have taken it on if they hadn't done a ton of work to persuade her that this was had a real basis.
Mm-hmm.
And she did this at a greatly reduced fee as well, right? Now they had, as student leader, they had to overcome some huge obstacles. One, standing. It was unclear whether, the university said we had no standing as a student government to sue. And it seemed like that's where doctrine was. And we were going to lose if it was student government. They created a nonprofit, Save the Green Space, incorporated that nonprofit,
Yeah.
hired the lawyer. It's the one that filed the lawsuits. And
Yeah. Which is impressive on so many levels too, because even like now there are playbooks based on things that people did back then. And it was all like
the internet.
It's just like students self-organizing with help from the community. It's a great story.
Yeah. The nonprofit held fundraisers. I remember organizing one in Bradenton with we made connections with these communities that hated the airport because of the noise, didn't like the expansion. We did a fundraiser for Save the Green Space to help pay the lawyer that brought new college students and people with these community, people who lived in these poor, often like lefty housing near to poor. They didn't have a ton of money to give, obviously, but raised a little bit of money there. And so that's like something to create. And that was those folks, I supported it. I was helpful, blah, blah, blah. But those folks were the ones who like designed all this.
Yeah.
Then there was also the challenge. We still had to get money to this lawyer, right? And campus basically said student government cannot pay a lawyer. I shouldn't say they said that. We could not pay a lawyer. They had to find, and eventually we and myself a little later, ways to get money to a lawyer without violating the law.
Right.
That was not easy. In one case that proved controversial, but was successfully done, Judy was paid a speaking fee, hired by New College to speak on environmental issues, was paid a fee, a campus worker, person who had to sign off on it, signed off on it for the campus because they had it, and that helped us out. I mean, she's less than her time, but she got some money, and through that kind of creativity, that, of those folks, that was how that got done.
You had a DJ a while.
Well, that was later. So later, I'll tell you, after the arrest, Jen was president, I was vice president.
Jen Granick, yes.
Jen Granick, great person. Anyway, we'll hopefully get to that. So I think it's easy to see it as this kind of like tilting at windmills. I really don't think it was that. I mean, the deck was stacked, but it wasn't impossible.
Yeah.
Then if you sort of fast forward to like the day when the decision happens, right? And they're allowed to go in. So
right.
we hear that news on Sunday night. They were supposed to provide.
And just timing wise, Eric, it sounds like there was a lot of activity it was really a kind of tight window there between January and May, right? So like this is moving very fast, right?
Right. And so the lawyers filing briefs, they're trying to, I think one of the key is they needed to get a permit to do the construction. And we were objecting to the permitting.
Mm-hmm.
It was all going on through that kind of permit process. When the permit was granted, we were supposed to have, or affected parties, I actually dug out an old letter to the editor I wrote to the Sarasota Tribune.
Yeah.
The coverage was not quite, this is actually basically about notice requirements, that they hadn't met their notice requirement. So it comes down at the final, okay, they're going to do this tomorrow. We hear on Sunday night, they're going to do this tomorrow, right? So when that happens that Sunday night, the first thing we do is reach out to Judy Kavanaugh to get a temporary restraining order.
Yes.
The plan, first thing in the morning, she's going to go to court to get that, try to get that. Question is, when will we be able to get it? She thought she could get a TRO. how quickly will it happen?
Mhm.
Then the strategy that night and in that day was, can we do anything to slow the process,
Yeah.
even by an hour or two?
Run out the clock. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that night, we all stayed up all night and we all moved all this furniture there and all this wiring, all this stuff. And we also started talking about civil disobedience and putting ourselves out there.
Was this before or after Les Mis was on Broadway? Because it does have an element. Okay. Okay.
We're ahead of our day. So we were up all night trying to do that. And it was like, didn't work in the end, but that was the strategy.
Mhm.
Then that morning, so around 8 a.m. or I don't know the exact time, but 8:30 a.m., Dagan and I went and we met with General Heiser. I dug out my old affidavit. I was trying to remember. I feel like I met with General Heiser. I don't remember that, and David.
General Heiser, everybody knows, but like the
New
foundation.
College Foundation, one of these kind of key bridge people in helping us win these Republicans over.
Right.
A conservative guy,
Hmm.
well-decorated general, heads our foundation, stood up for New College, and had just a lot of credibility with Florida Republicans.
Hmm.
And so Dave and I went to his office and we said, look, they're about to do this. We are in court right now. We just need a few hours to get a stay. Can you call, the company? Can you call everybody? Can you help us? And we specifically said, look, if you don't stop it, right, dozens of us will be arrested.
Mm.
And think about the headlines. Do you think that will look good for the school with your audiences if, I don't think we give them a number, dozens and dozens of our students are arrested?
Yeah. Scores, maybe.
And he agreed, I believe he tried. I know him pretty well. Knew him well. He was a decent guy. We went from there to Barilski's office and met with Barilski and did the same kind of thing. I don't know what he did. And parenthetically about Barilski years later,
Because he was like USF, right?
But he was our dean jointly.
Right. During the merger.
He did not, I think in some ways, a year or two later when we were doing something else, and he actually did end up signing something that helped us with some of the legal fees for us. And he was like, which he really didn't want to do, but he signed it. And he said something like, why do you, and, I just feel bad that all the students don't like me. Well, anyway, then Dave and we go back there and then, at that point, the construction equipment's coming in. And so, a bunch of us, so Jonathan, day of, like in terms of mobilizing people, organizing people, rallying people, Jonathan White was kind of first among equal, a lot of great.
He wasn't dressed as the Lorax, but he was kind of convoking the spirit from an early period.
He also went through the campus and sort of did a polarization.
Yeah, well, people were running through early. So all this activity was like on two fronts that morning. Like David and I, overnight, we were all doing this stuff. David and I went down to the other side of campus to try to deal with the administrators, while John and other folks were rallying all these students and getting, a bigger and bigger crowd of students there, so that when the construction equipment showed up, we would be out in force.
Mm-hmm.
And then, as the equipment came, and it was just very. Myself and Jonathan were among those who were arrested.
Right.
From the student.
And this is pre-cell phones. This is like, you're on the other side of campus. You got to figure out what's happening. And ultimately,
we ran back and we were there well in time. But I remember seeing it as they're rolling. I remember sitting there. And for me, one of the most heartbreaking was we'd all worked so hard overnight to move this stuff in. And just seeing how quickly the construction equipment took it away, oh shit, we're really in trouble. And we were just praying that stay would come through before then. But, so Jonathan and other folks were just amazing at galvanizing everybody on the ground in that leadership. And we kind of, I don't know if it was formally or informally among ourselves, among the people who were involved on the student government side. It was like, it's okay for some of us to get arrested, but we need some people not to deal with media.
Yeah.
lawyers to deal with, and so David and Rob Westerfeld and Adam Oler from the campus council was really supportive. Like those guys weren't going to get arrested and we're going to try to manage that. And Jonathan and myself and other student government, Eli and others were. And then, obviously a whole bunch of other students. And what was most amazing to me about the students getting arrested was there was just such a cross-section of different parts of the student body. Some people who are really into politics, some people who are not that into politics. First years and nth years, just people who are kind of cynical about a lot of things in their lives, yet we're willing to do that.
Wasn't it like artists too? I thought like, 'cause there was like art in the Grove.
Yeah, it's anything. New college, there has to.
We're playing music too, weren't they? Wasn't there a stage of some kind or?
Okay, that's testing my memory. I remember John reading the Lorax. I don't. I think there probably was a music now. I'm saying it, but I don't. The sad part is like memories become,
right.
It's like it becomes fuzzy.
That's why we need to work on the screenplay, Eric.
What are your memories of being in jail? Were you all held together in one cell?
Yeah, well, the guys were in one cell, the women in another cell. And I remember first going, I looked at my affidavit and it was like, you're basically in handcuffs for 2 hours because you're waiting to go onto the bus. They loaded us up all onto this bus. And then it takes a while to get there and process. And then we were all in this one room. And I think what was most, is you're in this room with these really funny, talented people like Merle.
Yeah.
We were all miserable at one level and all wanting to know what was going on the outside. On the other hand, it was also like, I don't know, there's a real feeling of, closeness among everybody. There was humor for sure with the folks. It wasn't just Merle, but a bunch of other folks, a whole bunch of very creative, whatever the exact, it's like a bunch of very creative, funny new college people in there. And so the jail, I guess what it says, we weren't scared. We all felt like we were in the right. We knew we had lawyers trying to get this stay. We knew this, it's like a hostile local government. So we didn't feel great about that, but we also, I don't think people were.
It was a little good trouble, right?
It was, yeah. It felt like everybody felt really good about what they'd done and just mad about what they had seen.
Because the trees actually were bulldozed, right?
Like bulldozed that day, and we got the temporary restraining order a little bit later. And that's one of the things that's not often told about it. Judy got the restraining order a couple hours too late to stop it. And a week later, as they're fighting the restraining order, it got dismissed because it was moot. Part of the grounds for it was, well, the trees are gone, so you no longer need.
You got to fire up the DeLorean, get the flux capacitor going.
Yeah.
And they just did the same thing again, just in the recent past, except it was even worse.
Yeah. I think there was this strategy that we had. It was, didn't work, but I think it was a reasonable strategy, realistic. We got the charges dismissed right away because of the stay. When the judge saw that there was a stay, they dismissed the charges right away. Then what happened, though, what was interesting, a couple months later, the local prosecutor decided to try to reinstate charges, come up.
Okay.
And so that became a kind of second round of this where we were all basically told you're going to be prosecuted. And I don't know exactly how this was done under double jeopardy, so I don't know. Maybe it was dismissed, didn't eliminate jeopardy. But we were all under that threat. So we had to get a lawyer again. And this would be a criminal defense lawyer. And none of us had money. And student government couldn't pay for it. And so Jen and I, as he was president, I was vice president, had to figure out, okay, how do we help students, right? Some people could contribute a little money to a lawyer, but many of us couldn't. And so that's where some of the things like the Foves concert and,
monkey business or
like where the Foves are paid X $100 to perform.
Yeah.
For fun.
Foves, for those not in the know, kind of legendary new college band back in that same period.
Merlin's band.
Yeah, I think back there was Merlin, Chris Sizemore, Marty, and
Joe Pettit.
Yeah, Joe Pettit, of course.
There you go. Even if the individual memories fail, Eric, the collective memory is there for us, which is part of why we're doing this podcast. That's an amazing story. We usually like to ask guests what was their thesis. on, and any baccalaureate tales if you want.
Sure. So my thesis, very much inspired by Gene Lewis, who was like his big thing. One of his big things he taught about was the role of technology in democracy. The idea that technology is like this autonomous political force in our politics. We think we control it, but there's a logic of technology in our, maybe in our market society that, we would read stuff about how if it can be built, it will be built, basically. And so Jacques Ellul, Langdon Winter, we read all this.
This early 90s, right?
Early 90s, yeah. So just as, it's kind of ironic, like given what we've seen, and now with AG, AI.
Are you breaking something? You're in the valley there. Are you saying AGI? It's here? Did it just drop? Okay.
AI, but then the titans of the universe, the leaders, give us AGI.
Absolutely.
Even if it could kill half of us or
That's another episode. Absolutely.
Another episode. But anyway, so I was interested in technology policy and trying to understand the government's policy toward technology and what is it. And this is a time of when the government's doing industrial policy to promote certain technological sectors. So I was studying like the domestic and defense policies around technology, and from this lens on, and it was kind of very much informed by this kind of concern that we're just kind of encouraging tech to run amok, basically.
Wow. Prescient.
Yes, I know. I did actually, my first solo academic article was on technology and democracy. Yeah. And moving away from that. But my memory of the baccalaureate is like, there was one reading of my thesis, which could be like, oh, the government shouldn't be doing all this stuff to sponsor these tech industries.
Right.
It still was one of the things that stuck out. The baccalaureate was Gene Lewis, like commenting to the group and to me. So all this education, and we've turned you into a Republican, right? He's anti-government, which is not, it was sarcastic. It's not, but it was just, it kind of stuck out in my head, right? I mean, obviously a very different resonance of what that would.
Yeah. That's amazing.
But it also spoke to like the fact, does return to the point about bias and the whole point of our education was to take any kind of accepted wisdom or whatever and question it, challenge it, in us as welfare babies. Give me that question there, right? Not training people to be knee-jerk liberals or Marxists or conservatives or whatever.
Yeah.
Get us to challenge our assumptions and ideas. I feel like that was a through line for me there from the moment I arrived to the end. And I think is one of the, outstanding features of New College as it existed, is entirely opposite that caricature that was produced by DeSantis and his people.
Yeah.
Really, make the institution stick out.
Mm-hmm.
Produce lots of iconoclastic thinkers of different, approaches.
Absolutely. Amazing stuff. Any final questions, Megan or Grant? And then we'll probably want your bring it home, whatever your concluding remarks you want to share. But any final questions, Megan or Grant?
Did you make mixtapes and things like that for a while? Am I remembering right?
Yeah, I love doing that. Yeah, I posted a bunch of walls and did a bunch of mixtapes.
What were your most successful songs to get people out?
Oh, man. Well, so I was a big P-Funk person.
Yeah.
But it was a lot of like Splash Light and God, a little Too Funky in Here by James Brown. I remember people like that quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Then we would do, there were some Paid in Full. That was not my original, but it was like a big, and it was definitely a very heavy funk, rap, reggae period.
Yeah.
Shy and Talking Heads.
And were you still there when Groove is in the Heart dropped?
That was definitely.
That is the one that I always think of as the song that was owned.
That would get everybody up. Yeah, I remember seeing Light up in Tampa or near Tampa sometime after that came out.
That's awesome. Anything else, Grant? Or
I await the sermon with.
Let's do it. Bring it home, Eric. You brought us back. We learned how your relationship with Gene Lewis and others sort of propelled you on a career as an academic, and then also how you were drawn into a political role as a very young student at New College that then led you right into the middle of the Lorax Rebellion. Covered a lot of political science stuff from your work as a professor at Berkeley. The stage is yours. Bring us home. Make it all make sense.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, obviously New College while it had its challenges and flaws and was not for everyone, I mean, I can say for me personally, it was incredibly valuable. I would not have, I would be a different person now, just both in terms of approach to life and, what I study and how I think about politics, could not have gotten anywhere near there without that experience, without the professors, without the peers, without the environment. It was just a tremendous experience for me. I'm grateful.
Amazing. Amazing stuff. The name of the book is
Partisan Nation, The Dangerous New Logic of American Politics.
Partisan Nation, The Dangerous New Logic of American Politics. Dr. Eric Schickler, thank you so much for joining us on today's episode.
Great to be with you, with all of you guys.
And thanks again, as always, Megan and Grant. Thanks to our listeners. We'll be back again soon. This is the Palm Court Podcast.